Hey guys, I wanted to make a video to be an Arcane Mage guide for Season 1 of Dragonflight. I'm going to be looking at talents and rotation and dummy test gameplay over two videos. So this first one will be about talents, um, just basic stuff. If you know what the talents are already, you can just skip this video basically, but if you want an explanation into what they are and what they do, then hopefully it's only for you. But the second video will cover rotation and the dummy test. Hopefully this will give you guys a more visual representation of what's going on, so you can get a more holistic approach to what Arcane is all about. But without further ado, so to start off, super basics of Arcane, two core spells, right? Without looking at them. So Arcane Blast and Arcane Missiles. Arcane Blast, very long cast time, low mana cost, low damage. Every time you cast it, you get a stack of Arcane Charge, and each stack increases damage and mana cost, but reduces its cast time. So the more you cast it, the better it becomes, but more expensive. Arcane Missiles, on the other hand, just is a channel, 2.5 seconds baseline. Obviously scales with haste, does pretty mediocre damage. More than an Arcane Blast at one stack, but obviously it will start to fall off as you get more and more stacks. Yeah, typically you don't cast this ever, outside of just getting a proc, which we'll look into in a second. But yeah, so that's the identity, right? We build stacks. So you might be asking, okay, well, how do you dump the stacks? Well, you dump the stacks by getting this talent over here, Arcane Barrage. It does damage, and for each Arcane Charge you have, it does a bit of extra damage, and most importantly, it consumes charges. Very low cooldown, basically no cooldown. Yeah. So let's get into the talent. So first, Arcane Missiles we already talked about is augmented by Clear Casting. When you get this proc, basically Arcane Missiles becomes free of mana, which is relevant, and channels faster. And along with channeling faster, this proc will also give you extra missile ticks, which makes it more powerful. Also, it lets you cast while moving with this talent here when it's procced. And yeah, you can also have up to 3 of them at once. So you may be asking me, okay, how do you get this proc? You get this proc by spending mana. The more mana you spend, the higher likelihood you have of proccing it. You have the text here, 1% proc chance per 1250 mana. So yeah, any mana expenditure gives you procs, not just, Arcane Blast. Other talent to look at is Arcane Orb. You just throw it, it generates one charge on cast, and then one charge every target it hits. So on single target, this will give you 2 charges total, one on cast and one on hit. But on AoE, it will give you more, right? Because you're hitting more than one target. This is very good for basically skipping stack 1 and stack 2 of your arcane charges, because as we know, Arcane Blast is weaker the lower stacks you have, so you want to avoid casting weaker spells. That's where Arcane Orb comes in. It lets you skip those spells, right? So the first Arcane Blast you cast is effectively at 3 and 4 stacks. Nether Precision over here gives you clear casting, makes your clear casting, like when you use it, your next 2 Arcane Blasts are stronger by 20%. This is quite powerful, and we'll be basically utilizing this and trying to waste this proc as little as possible. Ideally, you're going to be doing something like Clear Casting Arcane Missiles, Arcane Blast, Arcane Blast. Clear Casting Arcane Missiles, Arcane Blast, Arcane Blast, as an idea. This is just extra damage. This talent here you only take on, well, I guess technically right now you take it on both, but it doesn't do much in single target. I kind of already talked about this before, but you get haste 2% every time you consume charges, not per charge. So consuming 4 charges still only gives you 2% haste, but consuming 4 charges 4 times will give you 8% haste, Yeah. Arcane Familiar just gives you mana and it does a little bit of damage, but the maximum mana is here what we want. This spell here, Arcane Barrage, deals 15% increased damage per target it hits, which means that on one target it still does 15% extra damage, but if it hits more targets, it will deal extra damage to all the targets it hits. And you must ask yourself, how does it deal more damage to more targets? Through this talent here. Each Arcane Barrage hits one additional nearby enemy for 40% of its damage. So if you have 5 charges, or 4 charges, it will hit 5 targets for 75% extra damage. This one here you don't really take. because it's mana and we don't care about mana that much. We have enough of it. This one's useless. But you'll see that I've glossed over these two talents because they are cooldowns. So, to talk about our cooldowns. This is basically a big cast time. It's nuclear launch. You cast, boom. You burn all your mana, and it does damage based on how much mana you have. The way it works is that it will actually do double damage at full mana and like regular damage at no mana. So it's not a huge difference. You know, it's not like 10 times, but it's still a good amount. So ideally we want to cast this a decent amount of mana. But the most important thing is once it burns our mana, it actually regenerates our mana really quickly for 15 seconds. What it does is it gives us a buff that's really powerful, 35% increased damage, that actually goes up to like an extra 25%. Oh, actually, I think the 35 here already includes the 25%, but I could be wrong. But yeah, it's quite a powerful buff. But yeah, it gives us extra mana. So, this is our main cooldown. But Arcane does not work with just one cooldown, it's a combination of cooldowns. So you might ask yourself, okay, well, what are our other cooldowns to look at? The most important one to look at is over here, Touch of the Magi. Apply Touch of the Magi to your current target, accumulate 20% of the damage you deal to the target for 10 seconds, and at the end, it basically explodes. So anytime you deal damage to a target with Touch of the Magi, it adds more and more damage stored in this Touch of the Magi, which is 20% of every instance of damage it takes. And then at the end it explodes. If anyone plays League, this is very much like Z ult. You know, you deal damage, a portion of that damage extra gets stored, right? It's not like you lose that 20% and then it blows up. No, it's like an extra 20% gets stored. And this is a 45-second cooldown, where this is a minute and a half. So as you can tell, you can basically get two Touch of the Magi's per one Arcane Surge. So typically you do Arcane Surge, you know, Touch of the Magi, and then like 45 seconds later you'll do just Touch of the Magi, and then 45 seconds later you'll do Arcane Surge, Touch of the Magi again. Along with this, we have Arcane Echo and Arcane Bombardment. Arcane Echo makes it that whenever a target has Touch of the Magi, every time we do a bit of damage, any instance of damage, they take extra damage. It's like an extra proc. So if you think about like Arcane Missiles, which hits like 5 times in the cast or 8 with clear casting, this will proc 8 times. More importantly though, we have a dot over here called Nether Tempest, which basically fires off these missiles that tick on targets around the thing that has the dot. So if you dot the boss, it will kind of AoE around the boss. But that AoE also hits the target it's on, right? So that means that Nether Tempest will be ticking on the target itself, but also the AoE will also hit it. So you're getting like, I think it's about like 25 ticks over 12 seconds. 25 ticks of Arcane Echo, specifically. So that's a very strong. So you usually want to have Nether Tempest whenever you go into Touch of the Magi. Because it's a dot though, we want to apply it before Touch of the Magi, right? So yeah, very powerful with this. It also AoEs, which is good. I should have mentioned Arcane Surge also does a bit of AoE as well. But yeah, these are both AoE abilities. But they're both obviously very strong single target as well. Over here we have Arcane Bombardment. Basically, Barrage does double damage at 35% or lower HP. This is our execute. And over here we have Radiant Spark. You apply a debuff to a target. It does very little damage. It's not even, you don't even think about the damage. But most importantly, every time you deal damage to the guy with the debuff, it will give them a new debuff that makes them take 10% from the next instance of damage. Note, this is not every instance of damage. Like if you, for example, like if you have Arcane Echo ticking, it wouldn't actually consume Radiant Spark. But in general, this won't be an issue because we're going to be casting Radiant Spark before Touch of the Magi, and we're going to be using it up, so don't worry about this too much. But essentially, every cast you cast here ramps up until 4 stacks. So, you apply it, the target has 0 stacks, you cast 1. The first spell is like not amplified at all, but then it will apply the debuff that gives them 10% extra damage taken. You cast another spell, and now it's 20%, 30%, 40%. And then the spell that benefits from that 40%, which is our 5th cast, is going to be, amplified by 40%. And then that's it. Radiant Spark is over. This talent here makes it whenever you do damage to a target with Radiant Spark, it basically AoEs to 4 nearby enemies for 20% of the damage dealt. Just a little bit of AoE damage involved here. But this is actually quite powerful on single target as well. Other talents to look at over here is Evocation. Once again, another cooldown of ours. Basically, you channel for 5 seconds. You get a bunch of mana. It's your whole mana bar. But most importantly, over here you have Siphon Storm. Basically, whenever you press Evocate, you get an intellect buff for 2% every 0.8 seconds. Essentially, what this makes it do is that you want to full channel your Evocate because it gives you a lot of intellect. I believe it's 12% intellect over 30 seconds. So very, very powerful. And lastly, over here, we have Illuminated Thoughts, just a proc that gives you like a more chance of proc clear casting. This buff here, Concentration, this one is important to remember. Basically, Arcane Blast makes it so that your next, or has a chance to make your next clear casting not be consumed. So, you get the proc, then you can press your clear casting missiles, and then you'll still have your clear casting missiles. You won't consume a charge. But most importantly for our burst is this one here. Each time Arcane Missiles hits an enemy, the damage of your next Arcane Barrage is increased by 5%. This effect stacks at 20 times, so up to 100%. So basically, and this buff lasts forever until you cast Barrage. So the idea is that we want to have this to a decent amount, ideally, for our burst. You don't actually prioritize it that much right now with our gameplay, but nonetheless, this is quite an important talent for our gameplay, and it's worth looking at, to understand what's going on. And then some of the ones that I haven't mentioned are like Presence of Mind, causes your next Arcane Missiles to be instant cast. This doesn't actually change your damage, very important, because Arcane Blast is the same cast time as an instant cast. They're both a global cooldown long. There is a niche situation where this can be good, which is when you have like 0.1 seconds of Touch of the Magi left or something like that. You can Presence of Mind Arcane Blast. But most of the time, this will be more used for movement. So, I would strongly urge you to think of this as utility, even though there is a DPS value to it technically, very minor. But I would really urge you to think about this for movement. So, I've talked about all these talents. What do they actually do? How do we actually play with them, right? And the whole goal with Arcane is to sync up our cooldowns. As you can tell, there are a lot of cooldowns that are very similar in cooldown. So, Evocation 1.5. Evocation giving us this intellect buff, 1.5 minutes. Arcane Surge, 1.5 minutes. So we want to sync these up as much as possible, right? And then you have Touch of the Magi on a 45 second. So you want to be, as I mentioned before, like your damage cooldown profile is 1.5, 45, 1.5, 45, 1.5, 45. So you're rotating between big and small damage windows every 45 seconds. Also alongside this, we have Rune of Power, which is also on a 45, so you'll have this every single time. It's worth noting that Arcane Surge actually gives a Rune of Power, which is stated over here. Casting Arcane Power, which it should say Arcane Surge, will also create a Rune of Power at your location. Despite Arcane Surge actually giving you a Rune of Power, we will still cast a Rune of Power prior to our Arcane Surge window, so there's no random Rune of Power you're going to have to deal with. But we'll get into that in a bit. But yeah, so those are our talents. So, you also have Radiant Spark. Technically, it's a 30-second window, but you never cast it outside your damage windows. You're never going to be using this on cooldown. You might as well consider this a 45-second cooldown. It is as good as a 45-second cooldown. So once again, we're rotating between 45 minutes, 1.5 minutes, 45 seconds, 1.5 minutes. It's kind of like a big burst, mini burst, big burst, mini burst,